We've looked a little bit at some of the exploration that was happening around the world before Columbus. Now we're going to dive into the age of discovery, when the major powers of Europe were looking to expand their reach into the Americas and Northern Africa. So we begin this age with a little discussion about Prince Henry of Portugal, often called the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator. He funded a lot of the exploration that went along the coast of Northern Africa. He unfortunately began a lot of the slave trade, and that was some of the impetus for getting into that African continent. But he also funded some of the early voyages that went into the Americas. Christopher Columbus was another major figure that historically has been acknowledged for many centuries. In 1492, he made the first of several voyages to the Americas. And then we have Ferdinand Magellan, where he took a 3-year voyage to go around the world and eventually and unfortunately died in the Philippines, somewhat halfway through the voyage. Now at this time, Spain, Portugal, England, and France were all the major powers of that region of the world, and they were all competing for new colonies and trade routes. So competition was fierce. During that time, numerous voyages took off to the Americas, and we had Verrazano up north, Columbus, and Cortés in the Mexico, Central American region. We also had Balboa exploring Panama, and Pizarro, who worked his way through northern South America, as well as Lisboa. So the 1500s were a very busy time for expanding that influence of Europe into the Americas. Let's take Balboa as an example. He's well known for having discovered the Southern Sea. In 1513, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and he was a governor at the time in that region of Panama. And this was quite common. Viceroys, governors, all kinds of titles were given to the conquistadors in these New World areas where they landed. Now, when he made his way across and discovered this ocean, during his absence, there was a power struggle and someone else came to power, so that when Balboa came back, he was arrested by Pizarro. And some of the claims were that he was trying to set up his own government, and so he was tried on the spot and beheaded at that time. So 1519 was roughly when he lost his life. But nevertheless, his claim to fame was the discovery of the Southern Sea, which was soon to have its name changed. Ferdinand Magellan made that 3-year voyage, and you recall that I mentioned he was killed in the Philippines in 1521. But when he did come into the Pacific Ocean area, he renamed that Southern Sea that Balboa had designated that ocean to the Pacific Ocean because it was so calm and tranquil compared to his voyages through the Atlantic. Another interesting thing happened. When his crew finally returned to Europe, they noticed there was a missing day. And so this led to the creation of the International Date Line. As people were exploring the different oceans around the world, the maps of the world started to get more accurate. This was one of the first maps that was made that actually called North America, North America. This is now in residence at the Library of Congress. Now, once people were exploring a lot of these oceans, there was one critical area that they hadn't really been able to find access from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that was through the Northwest Passage, through the Arctic. So one of the big challenges there was dealing with the ice. So a lot of voyages were planned, but people had a hard time getting through. And there was some talk of perhaps an isolated sea and even a warm island at the North Pole. But people tried as much as they could never get through this pack of ice. Eventually, however, Roald Amundsen was the first one who did sail through that Northwest Passage in 1903. So, as you can see, it took a long time from the time of Columbus to get across that sort of missing link between the two oceans. We had another famous explorer as the 1900s were coming around, and this was a Norwegian scientist named Nansen. He deliberately stranded his ship in the Arctic and drifted for 4 years. Whether he planned on 4 years or not is kind of unknown, but he proved that there was no Arctic continent. And during this time, he made a lot of soundings and biological observations, meteorological observations, and for all this wonderful work and contribution to the sciences, he earned the Nobel Prize in 1922. Now you have to look at what these early explorers put up with. They certainly had it rough compared to the amenities that we have today. They didn't have breathable fabrics. It was all leather and canvas. There were no amenities on these ships. They were drafty, cold. There was even no refrigeration for food, so they had to deal with this, especially in some of these long voyages across the vast oceans. Typically, this is what they looked like, very hardy individuals, and especially after a long period in cold weather or at sea for a long time, they certainly transformed their appearance. This is Ernest Shackleton, who made several voyages to the Antarctic and was stranded there for a period of time as well. Now, another big quest for these adventurers, as the 1900s were approaching, was to find a way to the North and South Pole. So for the North Pole, Admiral Peary claimed to have made it to the pole after several others were competing with him. But those records were disputed, and eventually in 1969, Sir Walter Herbert from England tried to retrace Peary's steps, is now considered the one to have made it to the pole by unaided means. We also had Edmondson, again, he made that, besides the Northwest Passage, he was able to get to the North Pole by air in 1926. And then now if we focus down on the South Pole, Edmondson made it to the South Pole in 1911, 5 weeks before Captain Scott made it to the South Pole during his failed attempt to return. We also had Ernest Shackleton. As I showed you in the previous image, he had several polar expeditions, 2 of them to reach the pole, 1 attempt to cross Antarctica. But he was first to climb Mount Erebus in the Antarctic Peninsula. Here's another example of one of the ways in which people tried to reach the pole. This was André Salomon, who made a polar expedition in 1897. He only made it a couple of hundred miles before he was stranded on Whale Island and unfortunately succumbed and died there with his crew. This feat wasn't repeated until the year 2000, where a British individual, made it by steering an inflatable balloon to the North Pole. Nowadays, there's all kinds of competitions to keep that list of firsts going. People have made it with submarines, even snowmobiles. There's all kinds of ways to get to that North Pole. If you want to go nowadays, you can even hitch a ride on a submarine, pop up, and take a selfie as it punctures through the ice and then drops back below. And of course, it depends on what time of year you're able to make it to that pole, because as summers approach, the ice gets thin and some of that North Pole area may actually be free of ice.